What was one of the main reasons the housing market collapsed in 2008 and 2009? Most of you know the answer to this. It's because a lot of people were borrowing money they couldn't afford to pay back, and the government was supporting this. Well, unfortunately, now we see the exact same thing happening all over again. History is repeating itself, and I think it could lead to another disaster in the housing market. I'm going to explain this in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over the usual suspects. Once again, Freddie Mac has a new plan to support the housing market. What could possibly go wrong, right? We start by looking at a chart going all the way back to 1975 to today's date. This is an index of home prices, nominal home prices adjusted for inflation. We go from 0.4 up to 1.0. Back in 1975, prices were pretty reasonable when you look at the price to income ratios. And they stay pretty reasonable until the late 1990s. And what's interesting, editor, go ahead and throw up a chart. If you take this all the way back to the 1890s, home prices, adjusted for inflation, were actually flat. Getting back to the chart, in the late 1990s or early 2000s, you guys know what happened. Home prices went absolutely parabolic to a point in 2005, 2006, where our chart that we're using from longtermtrends.net actually has to point out that this was a housing bubble. You don't say. And then we know what happened to prices. They absolutely collapsed, bottom out 2012, and then go right back up to a level they were back in 2006, 2007? No. Actually, now they're much, much higher. So this begs the question, if we were in a housing bubble back here and it was completely obvious, how are we not in a housing bubble now? And it's not to say that prices can't continue to go higher and higher and higher. But just because prices are going up, that's what I'm referring to, doesn't mean that the housing market itself is fundamentally sound. So what's the solution? Well, according to the central planners at Freddie Mac and Fannie and Ginnie Mae, they say the solution to this housing market problem of unaffordability is just for the average Joe and Jane, the average American, to take on more debt. Because we know the solution to any problem is more and more debt. It's just like cowbell.
I gotta have more cowbell, baby.
So basically the government is Christopher Walken in the Saturday Night Live skit, where instead of saying that he just has to have more cowbell, they're saying we just have to have the American consumer take on more debt. So how do we do that? Well, here's how they spin it. Here's how they pitch it to you. They sit there and look at this chart and say, oh my gosh, look at how much prices have gone up. This is amazing. And forget the fact that people can't afford a house anymore. But this in and of itself is a financial miracle because they have so much equity that's built up in the real estate market. In fact, there's trillions and trillions of dollars of equity that if we could somehow just extract that, it would lead us to an economic boom to the likes we've never ever seen. Actually, never seen other than when everyone got stimmy checks in 2020 and 2021. That was a similar type of economic miracle that led to 9.1% consumer price inflation, if you believe the government statistics. But forget that for a moment. We'll sweep that one under the rug. Just focus on how much purchasing power is locked up in this equity. So Freddie Mac's genius plan is to actually get involved and subsidize the secondary mortgage market. Oh, that's right. So if you've got the average Joe here, he's saying, well, I'd really like to move. In fact, I'd really like to move even across the street, but I can't because I'm stuck in this 3.5% fixed rate 30-year loan. And if I sell my house and move, well, there's no way I'm going to be able to afford the same house. In fact, I probably couldn't even afford a cardboard box based on prices and interest rates right now. So how on earth do I take out all this equity so I can spend it back into the economy and create this economic boom the central planners are referring to? Well, Joe has actually thought about this before. So let's just rewind about a year ago when Joe went down to the local bank and said, hey, look, I'd like to pull out my home equity. I'd like to do a cash out refi or a home equity line of credit or something like that. The bank says, okay, Joe, well, this sounds good. What's your credit score? He says, boy, about 600. And they look at him and they say, no, there's no way we're doing this loan because you're too much of a credit risk. And they say, even if we did give you that loan, we would have to charge you at least 10%. So Joe says, oh my goodness, there's no way that I can ever afford to pay that high of an interest rate. It puts me right back in the exact same position as selling my house. But now all of that might change from the standpoint of the usual suspects that contributed to the first housing bust have now swooped in, riding in on their white horse, and have said, Joe, we've got a solution to your problem. We're going to get involved in the secondary mortgage market. So instead of going to the bank, forget the banks and the free market. And no. That's just old school thinking. Now, if you want a loan, you can go straight to the government. And your credit score doesn't even matter. You're going to get approved. Yay! Why? Because Freddie Mac is subsidized by the taxpayers themselves. Well, this is great news because not only does Joe get approved, but he gets a 3.5% interest rate. And in fact, they'll allow him to take out a loan at 80% LTV. More on that in just a moment. So the main takeaway from step number one is whenever you have a problem and the answer that you're given is just bigger and bigger government, getting your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam involved in the housing market, or any market for that matter, I can assure you that this never ends well. And unfortunately, that's the plan that Freddie Mac is trying to push right now as we speak. Step number two, now let's rewind a little bit and analyze exactly what Fannie and Freddie do. We need to understand this so we can determine the probabilities of this creating a problem or a disaster in the future, like we saw in 2008 and 2009. So we're going to go right over to Investopedia. Each buys mortgages from lenders to hold in their portfolio and repackage as MBS, or mortgage-backed securities. What we always call them on this channel, mortgage-backed sausages, because it's the exact same process. Oh, these things can be sold. Oh, yes. In turn, lenders use the money from selling the mortgages to originate more loans. Good. Debt on top of even more debt. And somehow they say this helps individuals and families access a continuous and stable supply of mortgage funding. Okay. So first and foremost, what are the trade-offs? But we'll save that for a separate video. What's happening here are these mortgage originators say we've got this $1 billion and we've lent it out. Now we've got these loans as an asset on our balance sheet. I guess we're just going to have to kick back and do nothing because we haven't got any more money. And then Fannie and Freddie step in and say, no, we'll buy those from you. In fact, we'll give you an even better price than what you'd get in the market. And Fannie and Freddie package those things up. They securitize them and they sell them off to Wall Street. And then basically Wall Street pawns them off on whoever they can dupe into buying them. Getting back to the article, according to their charters, Fannie and Freddie established secondary market facilities for residential mortgages and provide that operations therefore shall be financed in private capital to the maximum extent feasible. Again, what this is telling you is that they're going to take all of those loans off the balance sheets of these mortgage originators. So they basically have zero risk. And then they can go ahead and continue to give more and more loans. So the question becomes, okay, well, why won't the banks lend money to these private mortgage originators? Or why wouldn't the banks
that are lending for these mortgages just keep them on their balance sheet. I mean, if they're a great investment, if this is a no-brainer, then why on earth do we need Fannie and Freddie, effectively the government or government-sponsored enterprise, to come into the equation? Why isn't the free market providing this service? The answer, of course, is because it's too risky. And the only entity that is willing to take that risk is an entity that knows they're going to get bailed out by the taxpayer. Which takes us to the next part of the article, an implicit guarantee. Fannie and Freddie GSE status created perceptions in the market that its securities were safe. It was widely said that the federal government would step in and bail out these organizations if they ever got into financial trouble, like we saw during the Great Recession, the GFC. This was known as an implicit guarantee, given the market's faith in the implicit guarantee. And by the way, how does Fannie and Freddie get bailed out? Does the government do that? No, that would be the average Joe and Jane is bailing out because the government doesn't have any money. The only thing that they can do is take money from one person and give it to someone else, or in this case, give it to the entities that have taken on way too much risk, creating a housing bubble. And they do this, ironically, in the names of the Americans they say they're trying to help, which reminds us intentions don't always equal outcomes. Getting back to the article, the yield on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's corporate debt, known as agency debt, has historically been about 35 basis points higher than U.S. Treasury bonds. While the 35 basis points may not seem like much, it made a huge difference given the trillions of dollars involved. So going back to step number one, when I say that Fannie and Freddie are basically subsidized by the taxpayer, this is what I'm referring to. Because your friend and family member Fred will come out and say, oh, no, absolutely not. No, they're private entities. What are you talking about? They just use private capital. They have shareholders and whatnot. Well, fine. But at the end of the day, it's this implicit guarantee that the taxpayer is going to bail them out that gives them lower interest rates. And then they pass those lower interest rates on to the taxpayers that use them to borrow money they can't afford to pay back, creating a housing bubble and a housing bust that on net balance creates a lower standard of living for the poor and middle class.
Step number 3. So what's the real problem? I mean, where does this lead us? What's the end game? If you listen to the mainstream media, you hear that this plan from Freddie Mac could be the most incredible thing we have ever seen. In fact, it could be a new wave of stimulus, according to this article in the Financial Times. And oh, by the way, it's going to be a great solution for inflation because we all know that prices over the last few years have gone up and up and up. And this is squeezing the consumer. So what better way to solve inflation that was caused by stimulus checks than giving the average American that has home equity, well, even more stimulus? We all know that free money is always the way that you solve a problem of consumer price inflation. So let's go over let's go over the numbers, the details to see how this will likely play out. So we've got your friend and family member Fred. Everyone has one of these. He's the guy that always tells you that you're a conspiracy theorist and you should never watch that stupid George Gammon on YouTube, or in fact, anyone in the alternative media space. All you need to do is listen to the government because they are there to protect you. We all know someone like this, don't we? So getting back to your friend and family member Fred's finances, let's say that he has a house, well, right here, that's worth $500,000. Now, he bought it just a couple of years ago for $200,000, right around there. So from the standpoint of principal, he probably still owes $200,000 because all those payments that he has been making because his student loan was forgiven and he got the first round of stimulus checks. And he, oh, by the way, made a fortune in Dogecoin. So all those payments he was actually able to make was really just going towards interest. So he still owes the $200,000, but what this tells us is he's got $300,000 in equity. And his monthly payment, right around $1,500 a month, mortgage. Remember, 3.5 fixed rate, can't beat that. So let's just assume that he drives a FedEx truck and he makes $5,000 per month. More realistically, now that's probably about $10,000. But let's say that he has some sort of job where he's making $5,000 a month. It's about 60 grand a year. All right, right around average. And let's just assume that he's only spending about $4,000 a month because he has no motivation to go out and do anything. The benefit there is he's saving quite a bit of money. So he has this delta of about $1,000 a month. He's in a decent financial position. But then your insolvent Uncle Sam comes to him through Freddie Mac and says, hey, we know that you can't pull out any of that equity with a normal loan. I mean, they're so boring. Look at credit scores, and they just look at you as a credit risk. Well, we know that's completely unfair. So we will give you this loan, and it's at a much lower rate. We don't really care about your credit score, and we'll give you an extra $200,000. And you can go out there and spend it on travel, on restaurants. I mean, my goodness gracious. You could even just buy call options on GameStop and get rich. What's not to like? So he says, yeah, that's a good deal. I'll go out there and I'll do you a favor, government and mainstream media, and I will spend that money as fast as it's coming in. So what does this do? Well, you all know where I'm going with this. It's going to lead to the exact same type of inflation that we saw in 2021 and 2022 that were partially a result of the last round of trillions of dollars worth of stimmies. We get mo money, mo money, mo money.
More money, more money, more money.
But unfortunately, we get mo problems, mo problems, mo problems from a standpoint of there's no more stuff. Well, what's going to happen when you have mo money and no stuff? Prices are going to increase. So now let's go through your friend and family member Fred's financials, making this adjustment with the inflation that we could potentially see. I think that would be my base case if this Freddie Mac program is implemented. So remember, he can borrow 80% LTV. So his house is worth $500,000. Now he's borrowed $400,000, or before it was $200,000. So let's assume that his mortgage payment went from $1,500 up to $3,000. And you say, George, well, that's no problem. Because of this consumer price inflation, his nominal wages have likely gone up as well. And you would be right. But let's remember that those wages usually lag consumer prices, and therefore his purchasing power has gone down. So even if we had some extreme consumer price inflation, his wages, let's say, go from $5,000 up to $6,000. Well, okay, but remember, all of his expenses have gone up. Then his overall prices or expenses monthly go up to $7,000. So before, he was $1,000 ahead every single month. Now, he's $1,000 behind. So a lot of you right about now are probably saying to yourself, well, George, look, this is not a problem. You're just fear-mongering again. I mean, think about it. If we had some inflation there, I mean, prices would, at the very least, stabilize, might even go up, and he only has a 80% LTV loan. So he still has $100,000 of equity. If he gets into a pinch, then he can just sell his house, just downsize a little bit, and we don't have a problem. You're just making a mountain out of a molehill. Okay, fair enough. Let's think that through. So I just drew this little chart here just to give you a visual, going back to 2022 and now. And we know that home prices, although they went up massively in 2020 and 2021, since 2022, they're about flat. But let's also remember that supply is at an all-time low. Well, think about that. If supply is at an all-time low and prices are flat, that means demand is also at an all-time low. So if we have a lot, let's say millions and millions of friend and family member Freds out there that are put into a position where they have to sell their house, then what happens to the supply of the overall housing stock for sale? Well, that would go up. And if the housing supply goes up at a time when housing demand is at an all-time low, what would likely happen to prices? So my base case, all else being equal, and I acknowledge there are a lot of variables here. I'm just going through this not necessarily as a prediction, but more so you can understand the concepts behind this insane proposal from Freddie Mac. But my base case would be we get some inflationary pressures to begin with, and then it's followed by deflationary pressures. And not the good type of deflation, the bad type of deflation like we saw in 2009. Let's remember, the definition of insanity is doing the exact same thing over and over and over again and expecting different results. Well, now what they're proposing to do is pretty much the exact same thing they did in 2003, 2004, 2005, 2006, and expecting different results. For more content that'll help you build wealth and thrive in a world of out-of-control central banks and big governments, check out this playlist right here. I will see you on the next video.